This is by far the most extreme motherboard repair I have done so far. And today we're going to get the last missing parts back on the board and try to boot this epic Commodore PC10. I bought this Commodore years ago and it turned out to have the worst VARTA battery damage I have ever seen. The VARTA that sat here on the board spilled its guts and the nasty battery juice went all the way on both sides, along the edges, and messed up everything on its way. And the same thing happened to the other side of the board. The solder was so badly corroded that I had to grind away a layer, and it still required a silly amount of flux to melt. So far we have removed all the damaged components, cleaned up and removed the corroded solder on all the traces with a grinding pen, and then we tinned the board to protect the traces from further corrosion. In part 5, I went through my stash and we replaced all the missing components that I had in stock. And since then I have ordered and received the components that we were missing. So let's get them back on the board and finally try to boot this Commodore. And before we continue, I'd like to thank our sponsor PCBWay. Aside from making excellent PCBs, they also do CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, 3D printing and injection molding. Perfect for makers like us. Get an instant quote now at PCBWay.com. And don't forget to check out their shared projects page. Browse among many open source projects for your favorite vintage PC. I guess we'll just start from here and then we'll go all the way around the board this way. Now, as you can see, we had most of the components that were missing. So first out are these 74LS245, and I have already installed a socket in the previous video. Okay, so let's get a bus transceiver in the socket here. And these are supposedly new old stock of eBay. And next up we have a missing resistor pack here. And unfortunately I don't have any, but luckily these are very simple resistor packs with just 7 33R resistors across. So I'm gonna replace that socket with a bunch of resistors. And next up we have 4 RAM chips, and these are Oki branded 41464, and they are adding 128K to reach the onboard 640K. I didn't have any, but thanks to viewers' comments I found a couple of these in my Commodore C64Cs. And next up we have a 74158 up in this socket here. And then we are missing a resistor pack here, so I will add some resistors off camera here. And then we have a 74S10 up in this socket here, and another resistor pack that I will replace with resistors off camera. And then we've got a 74S00, so the lowest numbered 74 logic chip, and it contains a bunch of NAND gates. And the last missing chip on the board is this Oki M6242B, and that's our real-time clock. I guess I'll add those resistors off camera now. Okay, and the last thing I think we are going to do before we boot is to replace this bodge wire, because the insulation is coming right off as soon as I apply some heat to this stuff. So there might be a short, or at least there's a risk of a short here. So let's just replace this wire. And since I made that bodge, you guys recommended that I should try out PTFE. And I have done so, and that stuff is great, so thanks for the recommendations. That stuff is way better than the crappy wires I used before. But I recently watched Retro Channel, and he used a thin enamel copper wire. And I thought it looked neat, so I wanted to try it out. So I guess you can barely see this stuff, it's so thin. This wire is just 0.3 millimeters. So let's remove this crappy wire here. And the insulation on this wire is so thin. So the idea is that it will melt right off when we apply some heat. Yeah, I think it does. But I think we might as well replace this wire too. Let's apply some fresh solder first. Yeah, this pad is gone. So I don't have a proper microscope. So this is really hard to do on camera. Yeah, it looks really weird with a transparent insulation. So now we can just snip this wire off. And yeah, I have to say it looks pretty neat. I'll clean it up and we'll try it out for continuity. Okay, so let's see what we've got. Yeah, definitely. So let's see if the insulation is still good. Yeah, it is. Yeah, this stuff is great. And it smells like my childhood. I'm not sure why, but I guess I was soldering animal wires as a kid. This stuff smells exactly like when I was playing with electronics as a kid back in the 80s. Yeah, I'd say this stuff is great. We're not quite done yet. We have a few jumpers to put back on the board. And these are the original jumpers, so I'm using some deoxit. And the manual doesn't say what they are. It does tell us what these are, but then it just says all other jumpers are for factory use only. But luckily I took pictures of the board before I removed them. And we better check them for continuity, because they were a bit crusty. Yeah, they're still good. And we are optimists, so let's remove the sticker from the piezo speaker. And the final step is to set the dip switches for the graphics. And according to the service manual, switch 1 should be facing up for US and Europe character sets. And switch 2 is for mono in its upper position and color for the lower position. And the third switch should be facing up too for monochrome. And the same thing goes for switch number 4. And that's all I can think of. So I think we are ready to test. I guess we'll start with a diagnostic card. And these ISA slots were really crusty, but they cleaned up quite nicely. But let's put some fresh deoxit in the slot before we use it, like so. And a really weird power connector. Okay, the moment of truth. Let's just flip that switch and see what this board will do. Well, we have power, but no posts. Although I'm not sure how helpful that card is with this weird Commodore BIOS. But at least we can see that we have power and we have a clock. Let's try the reset. Yeah, that seemed to work too. Well, in that case, I think we need to try it out with a display. And according to the service manual, this Commodore should work with the IBM 5151 here. So let's give it a try. I don't expect much from this card with this weird BIOS. But I was hoping for that famous Commodore PET sound. But let's give this a try and see what it will do. And nothing much, I'm afraid. Let's see if any of those chips get warm. Well, the chips are getting warm, but nothing is suspiciously hot. I'll leave it on for a few minutes and make sure that none of the chips are getting really hot. Let's see if we have a composite signal. No, absolutely nothing. Well, while we were repairing this board, we found a burnt trace near the onboard graphics chip. So we know that something went wrong with the graphics on this board. And that's probably the reason why it was put out of service back in the day. So I went through the service manual, but I couldn't find any jumper settings to disable the onboard graphics. But let's try with the graphics card in the ISA slot anyways, and see how it will behave. And absolutely nothing is happening. I guess I'll try the other two slots, because we did have quite severe corrosion in the ISA slots. And no, that doesn't work. Probably because we need to disable the onboard graphics. Well, then I guess it's time to bring out the scope and see if we can find any clues. Well, I had a second look in the service manual and I noticed that we have this option here. No monitor. And switch 2, 3 and 4 should be facing down. So let's try that before we start poking around with the scope. So switch 2, 3 and 4 facing down. Okay, let's try it out. No, that did not help. So let's move on. I have checked the voltages before, although I'm not sure if I have on camera. So let's check again. So we've got the 5 volt rail here. That's good enough. And minus 12 on this rail. That's good enough. And 12 volt rail here. Looking good. And then a second 5 volt rail over here. That's good enough too. So we know we have voltages. And we have also checked for shorts. But let's check again. Because we have added some components since. 67 ohms on the 5 volt rail. And no continuity on the 12 volt rail. And we're in the mega ohms on the minus 12 volt rail. And the second 5 volt rail is 10k. Okay, let's start with the resets. So I'm gonna slow it down to 500 milliseconds. And we've got reset on pin 21 on the CPU. Let's boot and see what it does. Yeah, that looked good. So it does reset. So let's move on to the ready pin and see how that looks. Well, it goes high, but I'm not sure it should have this weird signal. But at least it's going high. So next up is clock on pin 19. Let's see if we have a clock. And we do. So we're off to a good start. Let's move on and check the address lines. Yeah, the first one looks good. Yeah, good. This one too. Still good. Yep. Yeah, the address lines look good. Now we're moving into those multiplexed. Yeah, they just look weird. So these are address and data lines. So that's why they look funny. So I'm just checking to see if we have a signal at all. So we're not gonna care too much about what it looks like. And we have a few more on this side. Okay, so I'll just quickly go through the remaining address lines on this side. And I can't see anything weird. So it looks like this board is actually running, but we don't have any graphics. Let's just make sure that the graphics card is still good. I haven't used it in a while. Some more deoxit. Yeah, I don't know if you have seen the previous videos about this machine. But those ISA slots look absolutely horrible before we clean them. Let's add a freshly tested Hercules card and try again. And unfortunately the same result. Let's do a blind test. If this board completes post, it should start seeking from the floppy disk. and unfortunately nothing is happening. So this board does not complete post. And this is similar to the behavior I had when I tried this board before we restored it. So I think we still have a bad chip on board. And that nasty battery juice went all over this board. So I guess one way to go about this is to bring out the scope and start poking around and see if we can find a chip that is misbehaving. Well, this is what I had time for this week. I'm pretty damn pleased with what we saw on that scope. The CPU on this board is now running, but it doesn't seem to complete post, because I think this board should make a pet sound, and that floppy drive should start seeking. So now we need to figure out how to disable the onboard graphics. And I will also see if I can find one of those Paradise chips. It's quite likely fried, since it had a burnt trace next to it. But a bad graphics chip would not explain why it doesn't complete post. So something else is bad on this board. Thank you for watching. If you want to support this channel, like, subscribe and leave a comment. Don't forget to ring the bell below. And I'll start recording the next video.